Okay, well, the next speaker, who you've heard some from, Doug Whittaker here a little bit. Doug's down from Alaska, and as he said before, he's not really a mountain climber per se, but his expertise is an area that I find directly parallel to climbing, and that's in water trips. And I'll let Doug carry on from this point.
Okay. Thanks, Roger. Sorry to be part of two presentations on either side of your lunch. That's by design, right? Okay, so you heard that I'm not a climber. Despite my last name, I'm not related to any of those Whittakers that climbed Everest or runs Rainier or whatever they do, although I've used that at times for my benefit. I had a job at REI that I think I got because I had a last name. Anyway, my climbing career, it started when I was scooping ice cream at Old Faithful Inn in Yellowstone and backpacking a lot. And we came down and tried to do an assault on the Middle Teton. This is 1981, and we were 19 years old, and you can imagine how it all went. The woman that one of the women in our group started a small slide and broke both her legs. So my trip ended about a half an hour after it started in Garnet Canyon, and it was a sprint downhill to get the rescue crew up there. So maybe that's why I don't climb. I'm not sure if that's exactly right, but and the highest I've ever been is about 13,500, which isn't so bad, except it's the base camp, and it was on a trek, and I was throwing up all night that night. So anyway, I don't think I'm meant. I like looking at mountains, and I like being in alpine settings, but I like to stay a little low. Anyway, so you may wonder why I'm here. It's because I have a little bit of expertise in carrying capacity and visitor impact management professionally, and it's mostly been applied in river settings. And I'll start off by just talking about how there's some similarities between river trips, especially whitewater river trips and expeditions on those, and the same kinds of expeditions that you guys do up in higher country. They both take place a lot of time on water. One's in a frozen state, one's not, both white. The elite players in these activities are very obsessed with getting first ascents or ascents on different routes, and likewise in the river community, descents. They're very interested in those. I think the mountain community has more media cachet than the river community. People talk about the Everest of rivers. They don't talk about the Stikine of mountains. So anyway, I think that the imagination of higher peaks, people have more imagination about that, and they're more interested in that. But they're actually pretty similar in the way that people go about doing them. It takes a lot of expertise and that sort of thing. The three things I always talk about when you're talking about a successful trip on rivers, and I think it applies to what you guys do, you need skills to do it right, you need good equipment to do it right, and you need the gumption, the effort. And you can sometimes be short on one of those things, but the harder the trip gets, the more you need all three of them working together. And of course, to tie them all together, you also need judgment. And it's true in both kinds of activities. The unsuccessful ones have something missing on those. They both follow a lot of routes, and they tend to camp and do certain things in very predictable places. On rivers, it's rapids and camps. The top picture is from Grand Canyon, and the other is from Denali, the trip up West Buttress. And there's some interesting places where people are spending a lot of time because of the way the environment works, and those are where the impacts happen. And so it's an interesting parallel there. They both involve very high risk areas on those routes. And in rivers, it's the Crux Rapids. And in mountain climbing, it's often these places like ice falls and places where there's really technical climbing is required. And these become bottlenecks that are where crowding happens and where danger occurs and where it's more important to get it right. And everybody needs help to do these trips. We like to talk about independent climbers or independent river trips or whatever, but even those guys, they need help in getting their equipment. They don't build their own equipment. They don't always travel to the place by their own steam. Climbers fly into places. They all sometimes use porters on these hard trips. So they all need support of one kind or another. And it's really it's more of a continuum than a yes-no of whether or not you're supported. And of course, once you need support, other people figure out how to get money from that support, and they get good at it. And that's what commercialization is really about, is people turning that support into a livelihood for themselves. And that's not a pejorative way of talking about it, although it has some elements in it that might be adverse to what you're trying to do out there. And in the river community, taking people on these long river trips, these guides sometimes do everything for them. In Grand Canyon, for instance, they were using motorized boats, and they bring lots of gear, and they make it very luxurious. And but everybody uses some support, even the most independent private trips. Somebody's doing their shuttle. Somebody's, they're renting boats. They're sometimes renting food or buying food that's been prepackaged for their trip, that sort of thing. And people specialize in it and use it. And in both cases, people are actually very interested in the quality of experience aside from getting down the river or getting up the mountain. So the achievement part of it is important, and sometimes is the dominant thing that when they started their trip, but by the end of their trip, they're probably paying more attention to lots of other things that are going on and other outcomes that they're getting from the trip. People have a lot of different motivations for doing trips. This is what I did here was took 5 short essays about why I climb that were printed on the internet, and I did a word cloud with them just to sort of see what kind comes up. It's sort of analogous to the speaker the other day who asked us for that one word. These are kinds of the words that show up, but it basically proves that there's more to a trip than just getting to the top, as most of you know, and a lot of it has to do with experiential outcomes that are real important to people. So we should be managing for those things. We should be paying attention to those in both river settings and mountain settings. When you're thinking about that, you got to recognize that the number of people that are doing the same thing you are is a variable. Some people would like to pretend that it isn't a variable. It may not be the most important variable, but it is something that's going on out there. And so how many people we put in these settings matters in a lot of cases. This leads to this concept of, and this is a very common notion in tourism and recreation research, this notion that over time, so that's on the horizontal axis, and the number of people, as that goes up, as a place gets discovered and emerges and it gets commercialized and people start going there in more numbers, at some point that might change the way that place works, and it might become so-called saturated or overcrowded and has some changes occurring. And at those points, you have 2 routes that you can follow. You can let it continue to increase and the experience will change even more, or you can talk about stabilizing that use or stabilizing impacts and create a rejuvenation at whatever level you decide to do it at. And so a lot of what tourism and recreation management is deciding where do we want that thing to flatten out. And if we don't want it to flatten out, are we willing to let it just continue on getting higher and higher use? And sometimes we do let that happen, and other times we don't. So this is the notion of what kind of place do you want these great mountains or rivers, what do you want them to be? How do you want them to be managed? And it's really the realm of carrying capacity and visitor impact management to do that. I'm going to give you a quick tour of capacity concepts, and then we'll talk about how they apply to mountains. I hope this doesn't come off as an academic lecture. I'll try not to make it that way. The term carrying capacity actually comes from ships and how much stuff they can carry for the length of their journey. So it actually kind of fits in some ways. But they're talking about people on a boat, their own closed ecosystem. In some ways, our trips are like that too. It's often applied to range management. How many cows can you stick on an acre of land before the cows either get too skinny because there's too many of them and not enough food, or you destroy the plants that you want to grow there. So it's a range management concept as well. And then it naturally got applied to recreation, the notion that you can love a place to death. So that's Old Faithful Inn, and they're all waiting for the geyser to blow. So it's a common notion. We all sort of know about it in concept. We use it a lot in our terms, but it's useful to think about it in some other different ways. Sometimes we use it with regard to facilities. There's probably a sign somewhere in this room that tells us how many people can fit in this room, and that's based on some engineer's decision. Oh, there it is. It's 49. I think we've been consistently blowing that one. Oh, maybe that's just this section. All right, whatever. Sorry, that wasn't how I planned it. Anyway, we let our designers of facilities and buildings pretty much tell us what their capacities are. They design them for those sorts of things. Not a very controversial topic. Sometimes we pay attention to ecological capacities. This often gets talked about for the capacity of the earth, for instance, sometimes. But in a recreation setting, this is a place where people go to see brown bears catch fish. It's a state of Alaska run place. And they allow 10 people each day to go up to the falls and watch the bears. And they've decided that 10 is the right number, and if we have 11 or more, the bears might start acting differently than they would if there was 10. And it's been essentially a biologist's decision of what can work. Now, you can decide whether that's based on science or that we have 10 fingers, but the point is that I think it's also something we let the ecologists or the biologists do. If the bear biologist tells me that more is going to be a problem here, we'll probably defer to them. Again, it's not very controversial usually. If they tell us it's sensitive and it can't handle more, we often let them make that call. The one we all get bitchy about is social capacities, because everybody has some different ideas about what kind of place they want it to be. And those are a little bit harder to come about, and I think there's more debate about it. An example that I usually give is the Selway River in Idaho, a place where the Forest Service, way back in the early 70s, I think, made a decision that they wanted this place to anchor the Wild and Scenic River System as a very high-quality, solitude-oriented place, and they only allow one launch a day. And it's a short trip, so that if you launch on one day, you probably won't catch the people that are in front of you, and the group behind you won't catch you, so you'll have a true wilderness experience. You won't see anybody else on your trip. They've been managing it like that. They had no data or science to show that that use level would get them that, but they just kind of intuitively felt it would work. And they've been able to hold to that for years, and it's now defended strongly by the people that run that river. But it's very reduced use level. On the Middle Fork salmon, for instance, which has very similar rapids and similar kind of country, they have 8 launches a day. So much higher use level, and obviously provides a different kind of experience. But deciding which of those you want for your river or for your mountain is tricky, to say the least. When you're trying to develop a capacity, there's some certain things that are important about it. One is that you develop it through a process, and we'll talk about what those look like in a minute. That process will integrate technical, scientific, social data, or ecological data with evaluations about what you want. And it's both of those things together that gets you a capacity. You can't escape getting information about both. And it's not a magic number, although a lot of them sort of appear that way, because the thinking that went into them is not transparent. And hopefully our processes will be more transparent in helping you get there. There are several planning frameworks that researchers have developed over the years that help you take you through these various steps in excruciating detail. And I've spent 2 years of my life trying to get the guys that started these different processes to agree about the similarities between them and how they're more important than the differences. That's 2 years of my life I'd like to have back. The guys that invented these obviously have some stake in them, and they all work, is I guess my message. And they're all based on basically the same principles and the same steps, with subtle differences that are really not worth spending a lot of time on. What are those basic principles? Well, the first one, which we've heard a lot from at least 4 or 5 different speakers here, which is that any use that you have out there is going to create some impact. So, if you think you're getting off scot-free, you probably aren't. But that impact is maybe not damage. It depends on your value judgments about what's damage. And so that's what these planning frameworks try to do, is help you systematically go through and decide, oh, I guess I do consider that unacceptable, and here's why. It gets you basically to that point, and you figure that out for the important things, which are the conditions that you care about, the desired future conditions that Paul Anderson was talking about, and you use indicator variables to help you with that. And you set standards for those, which is your evaluation about what's going on. So it's those standards that define unacceptable. So I'm a social scientist. I don't believe there is an absolute there. I think it's something that we arrive at as a society, or as a community, as the case may be. You can't escape value judgments in this field, especially if you're talking about social values or social impacts. A beach like this means with a certain use level gets you one kind of experience, and if you put more people there, it's going to be something pretty different. And you've got to make a call about that. Both of those can be fun experiences. I presume, this is from a beach in China, I presume those people like that situation. Now maybe we don't, but they can all be good. There's high quality, high density recreation, and there's high quality, low density. You just have to make sure you know which one you're trying to get. And that's the basic story here. So what do you need to know to do that job? You've got to figure out the relationship between use level and whatever condition you care about, whether that's ecological, social, or something else. And that's a scientific story. That's a descriptive thing. That's something you can go find out. It's researchable. But then you have to go get the value judgment stuff too. You've got to find out from the population you care about, what do they consider acceptable for those conditions? If it's ecological, we might let the scientists decide that. If it's social, if you don't involve your user groups, you'll get yourself in trouble. I think that's what Paul talked about this morning. And then you can't really escape the fact that there are many other management actions that are not related to managing use that will affect the relationship between use and the impact. And I think we heard that from Ben with regard to the Knoll stuff, the Leave No Trace stuff, sorry. Many speakers have spoken about how it's not use level that's the problem, it's what they do or how they do it. And it's true, if you can change their behavior, you can fix a problem. And Roger's stuff with the human waste is the classic case of that. So we'll talk a little bit about all of those things. Getting information about how use level affects a condition is crucial and something that we rarely get the agencies to do. One of the places we got some money to go do that was in Yosemite, where there's been some social research for many years. Not by me, but by the park before we even got involved. Where they measure how many people are coming into Yosemite Valley, how many vehicles per day, and relate it to use levels and densities on the trails, like going up to Vernal Falls, or visiting Yosemite Falls, or visiting Bridal Veil Falls, those sorts of things, attraction sites. So information like that can help you figure out things. There's researchable information about what people think how many is too many, by showing them pictures or asking them on site to evaluate what they're seeing. And so that's something that we did here in Yosemite Valley with regard to the rafts on a short segment of river right in the middle of the valley. And we showed them those pictures and they rated them. And like you would imagine, they like the higher use or the lower use settings better than the higher use, and it gives you some decision points about what you ought to be managing for. And then, as you've heard here, there's lots of things that we ask river users to do, and you guys can ask mountain climbers to do, that will eliminate or at least dramatically reduce some of their impacts that are not related to use. And so on Grand Canyon trips, they put tarps under where they cook, and they do dishwater hygiene and whatnot to help prevent the red ants from coming in. Those have ecological effects. They carry out their waste. They carry out their ashes on the Middle Fork salmon after you've finished a fire. So they do a bunch of things that make the place, they eliminate those impacts as a problem. But we're still left with some other impacts that remain. You guys have already covered this topic, but here's a great example of it. This is the bottom right-hand corner is a picture of Stoneman Meadows in Yosemite Valley and the massive social trails that used to exist in there, and a spider web of trails, which created meadow fragmentation, which is bad for the various critters and plants that want to move through that meadow, and water that wants to move through that meadow. And that fragmentation index went from 40%, which is terrible, to 99%, which is excellent, in the span of 20 or 10 years or so, despite use increasing by building one boardwalk that directed people's use. So that's that structural fix that got brought up in this session. You just cue people to use this one trail that you make nice, and then they won't make the spider web of trails everywhere else. They don't even have a regulation that says you can't walk through that meadow, but people don't anymore. So that's a way of a technical fix or a structural fix that works. Anyway, but did you see how lush we made it as well in 20 years too? That's another trick. You've got to build facilities to handle your big staging areas and your big infrastructure, and I think that happens in your climbing communities when you fly into places. You build base camps that can work. The Antarctica was another great example of that. But sometimes that's all not enough. So sometimes you might want to still manage use. And we do that either directly, where you make people get permits, and there's a few examples in the climbing world. And sometimes we go to the extent of, we not only make you, we limit how many can launch each day, but sometimes we limit where they can camp each night. So you have reserved campsites all the way down the river. On the Middle Fork salmon, if you didn't do that, you couldn't launch 8 a day and have a campsite to yourself, because people would bunch up and they'd be on top of each other and they'd be sharing camps, which they've said they don't want to do. The most important thing to Middle Fork floaters is to have a campsite to themselves. The only way we can make that happen is assign camps, which is why I go in May when they don't have assigned camps and the use is low, because I don't want to have to know how far I have to go each day. So there's some reasons that there's a trade-off there. You can also manage indirectly, and maybe it doesn't work so well. This is the confluence of the Kenai and the Russian rivers. These people are fishing for red salmon for a short period when the run comes in. It can be up to 1,000 people, basically shoulder-to-shoulder fishing. They call it combat fishing. I don't know if you have combat climbing, but if you think that that's a funny term and it's hyperbolic, you can go to the Soldotna Hospital and see a giant board with all the lures that have been pulled out of people's body parts. And then put on top of that there's adolescent bears running around this place trying to steal the fish that have been caught or eat the carcasses of the fish that have been filleted. And then add on top of that Alaskans, about 60% are packing guns. Combat fishing, it's real. Anyway, in this place, they actually do manage the number of people. That doesn't look like it is, but there's a parking lot, and if that parking lot is filled, they won't let you park on the road. There's actually 2 parking lots. There's one on that side, and then there's another on the other side, and people come across on a short ferry. But they do manage those to not let it get worse than this, and it used to actually be worse than this. One last place that they do something that's kind of interesting is they make everybody register. They have a limit, but it's really theoretical. But they make everybody register, and they keep real-time track of who's going. And so you see how use is climbing as people plan their trips. And when you see spikes of people planning trips, you start saying, gee, I don't know if I want to go that weekend. Look at how many other people are going. And they have actually, on purpose, spread their own use out without the managing agency actually having to tell them that they have to spread it out. And so it's a place where that's actually worked, and I think could be really powerful. I wish more places would try it. I think in climbing it could be the same thing. If you knew who else was coming, you might change your plans to try and get more solitude if you cared about that. Is there support for use limits on rivers? Well, it varies. In Alaska, there's a bunch of groups that don't like them at all and don't ever want to see them, especially power boaters. But there are some wilderness-type folks that are highly interested in those. We don't have limits in most of the rivers in Alaska. And that's true of other places we've studied it. You're not done, actually, and some of that acceptability of capacities depends a little bit on how the permit system actually works. And that's a different realm than capacity. That's what we call allocation. So capacity is how many is too many. Allocation is who gets the pieces of the pie. And I've got, well, I don't have it with me. I have 10 books in the back that cover the allocation topic. It's for rivers, but please take them home. Some of the issues in allocation are, one, whether you split the commercial and the private users out, where the commercials get their own allocation and privates get their own allocation. They have different permit systems. That's mostly how it's done, but it leads to some inequities. And I think that's what's going to happen in your community as well. The thing that's going on in Denali about whether 25% is the right amount or too much, eventually those two groups are going to, if they run up against the capacity, they're going to start banging each other's head over who got more. Common pool is where everybody's in the same pool, and then if they get one, they can go get a guide if they want. There are different ways you can do allocation. You could price them, right? Highest bidder. You could have a lottery. It's fair, but you don't know how your odds are going to be. You could have reservations. People who can plan ahead win. Or you could do on-site queuing. People who live close will win. They all have winners and losers. They all have trade-offs. And different people perceive them as being more or less fair. And that's also a complicated topic. Other complex things going on with allocation that seem to stump the politics of the river world. Whether or not the commercial outfitters that have been there in the past deserve what they've been doing when you come in with a permit system, or whether they should have to bid with everybody else that wants to maybe do it in the future. I think that's the way, with the climbing community, it looks like you guys have some fairly entrenched, famous companies that started these things, but they basically keep those permits for forever, as far as I can tell. And that's the same thing in the river community. There's some repercussions from that. The biggest repercussion is the fact that essentially those companies own allocation. They own a public resource, if you will. And unless they do something egregious, they don't lose that. And so then when they retire, they sell it. And so there's some philosophical things about whether you think private entities should be selling a public good like access. Bottom line is that the decisions in all those allocation things can matter on whether you perceive it as fair. There's winners and losers. It's a big game theory issue, basically. And it's complex to see who gets out. On U.S. rivers, so I was asking over the course of the last day and a half or so, I was always trying to find out how many of these places have capacity, climbing plans or capacities. I think rivers are ahead of you, but not by much. We've only got full limits for both private and commercial on 25 rivers, permit systems that are full-on permit systems. We've got about 90 others that have usually a private capacity specified, but they're not anywhere close to it, but they do have commercial limits, and those are usually enforced. And there's some differences there. And that on those rivers, most of the higher use rivers are day use rivers, and they can have somewhere between 300 to 1,000 people going down the river. And on the lower use rivers, sometimes we have as low as 0.5 trips per day, which means not that a half a trip goes, but that a trip goes every other day. Up to about 8 groups per day is what I would call a lower use river. Anyway, so there's some diversity in how these permit systems work and in what use levels they produce. So what's the story on mountains? All right, now this is where I'm going to get in trouble. I don't know these places. I researched enough to kind of get myself in trouble, and I know that there's people in the room that know way more about every one of these individual cases. So if I say something wrong, correct me right away, as opposed to letting me look. I mean, I'm okay, I'm being wrong. And I know that you're going to hear more about some of these in the future, and you've already heard about some in the past, in the last couple of days. But basically, I think you've got 2 mountains in this country that are fully capacities for both the private and the commercial segment and managed as such. They're up against that capacity. One is Mount Whitney, where it's roughly 250 people per day total. They've got different capacities for whether you're an overnighter or a through hiker or a day user and which way you come. And they had routinely 1,000 people a day going there before the limits. So it's well under what would be there naturally, and they put it in place. So that's just one interesting thing there. This is the only one I think that has a lottery system, and they do that in February for trips in the summer. They've also got some interesting carry-out waste regs. We talked about that at the Exit Strategies conference. The other one that's got full limits is Half Dome in Yosemite. This is the place with the cables. This is where not just mountain climbers climb. In fact, it's very rare that the mountain climbers would go up the cables. They wouldn't do that. Anyway, that plan went in about 2 years ago. 300 a day, 75 are overnighters, usually staying at Little Yosemite Valley, and the rest coming up for the day. Before those limits, it was about 1,200 per day. One other interesting thing is before they put in the full system, they started with weekends only, because that's when the peak was. And it used to be like 900 on weekends, 300 on weekdays. And then they put in the system that made you get a permit on weekends, and it immediately switched, exactly a flip. It went to 300 on weekends and then 900 during the day. So they got more than they were bargaining for. So then that meant that they had to put permits everywhere, which they did. And they went through a NEPA process to do it. It's a climbing plan, if you will. And their decision was based on free flow on the cables, mostly out of a safety issue, but I think there's some social experience things going on there too. If a thunderstorm comes in, they got to get a lot of people off the top of that thing, and they wanted to be able to have enough. They wanted to make sure there weren't too many people up there that they could do that. So they did some fairly complex studies to figure out what free flow would be created, and basically it's now 30 people at a time on the cables. Lots less than what you see in this photo. Denali, you heard more about that today. There's 1,500 people per year, a slight dig from me on that. I think per year isn't the right number that you care about. It's at one time that you care about with the bottlenecks that are happening up there. And so maybe you could have more or maybe you could have less, but you do already manage for bottlenecks by, Roger was explaining to me how they check you in a slow way to kind of to spread groups out, and the commercial guys are specifically distributed through the season so that they're spread out. And so there's other things in your management plan that take care of that problem for you. But you're going to hear more about that, and you already know something about that. Mount Rainier, you've heard some about that. You'll probably hear more. They basically manage their capacity by the number of people that can camp at specific places, like Camp Mirror and is it Camp Sherman, something like that. But they have numbers for those places. They don't always fill, so this is a place that could have more use than it does on some occasions. About 200 people a day go up there. The change has been 2,000 per year to now 10,000 per year. And there's a pretty substantial number of those that are commercial users. 3 outfitters there. I think there used to be 2. So that's some interesting things that are different about that place. Long's Peak. I'll probably get in trouble on this one. No use limit, I don't think. There's a limit on campers, but the guys that come up for the day, they don't count them. They don't know how many are going. They have bottleneck problems at some of the places. They have some carry-out waste issues. They have some toilets. I think you're going to hear about whether they work or don't work. So you'll learn more about that. They have some big parking problems down at the bottom, so that fits with the guys from the Access Fund. We're talking about how you got to manage the whole system, not just what's going on at the top or at a bottleneck. You might want to have to manage down at the approach as well. Let's see, Mount Hood, tallest mountain in Oregon, and it's got overnight permits because it's in a wilderness, but it has a ton of day use. And they have some search and rescue problems as a result of that because it's almost easy. It's almost a walk up, but then they get in trouble when weather comes in. Grand Teton, camping zone limits, but no limits on people that do it in a day, and there are a few people in this world who can do that kind of thing. But a lot of them come in by camp, so they probably have an effective capacity there. They've got only 2 guide companies, and they have some limits on specific routes, which is, I think, different from some other places. Mount Shasta counts people by making them get a summit pass, but it doesn't have any quotas or limits for day or overnight. Going over to Europe, the Matterhorn, they have a pretty extensive guide system, and they also have huts, and they use the huts to basically manage the numbers of people. If you don't have a spot in the huts, most people don't go. There's a ton of artificial protection. You heard about climbing aids from the Trust guys this morning. That's a huge confound in this issue, I think. The more aids that you have means that people with less skill level can get up there or get up there faster, and that changes how many you can have, basically. I think this is a place that there's a lot of death for the skill level. I think that's a lot more people die there than other places for the number of people that climb, perhaps. I'm not sure of that exactly, but there's a lot of talk about how it's the unguided that happens to. Whereas on other mountains, I think sometimes the talk goes the other way. Mont Blanc, you're going to hear about more of that in a minute, but I think the thing that's interesting there is they also use huts to manage the mountains, manage the total use on the mountains to a certain extent. And then a couple of years ago, I think they said that you couldn't camp if you didn't have room in the hut. And that caused a storm of controversy, and the climbers said, no, I'm not doing that. And so I think they have no de facto capacity now, because I think you can camp if you want to. And the huts are not a limiting factor anymore. And a lot of people go up that, 30,000 a year. That's more than some of the other places. Aconcagua, they do an interesting thing of they have fees that are fairly high, but they're higher in the high use season. So that works as a sort of a break on going in the high use, and it sort of encourages you to go to the low use. However, relative to the cost of going down there, that's probably a pittance for most of these climbers. We heard about this yesterday. I didn't have a slide about this till I heard that, but I think the cool thing there is that it's self-imposed commercial limits by the outfitter themselves. That's beyond rare in the river world, or anywhere else for that matter. And the enormous logistics and costs that go on there is a huge barrier, I think, as well, to super high use levels. You're going to hear more about Kilimanjaro. I learned a little bit about this at last night's party. I think there's somewhere around 50,000 people per year. You have to have a guide to go up the mountain, and that the huts have some reservation systems, so there's some breaks on it in that way. They also have a defined capacity that they develop through a limits of acceptable change process. And they're not there yet, but they do have some crowding at some of the staging areas, some of the larger camps that are on the main routes there. Mount Fuji, I don't think I need to talk about that. We got a great story about that. So, you know, interesting. The numbers there are astonishing, obviously, and nothing like anybody else has. I'm trying really hard to think of many recreation places that have that many people. We've got some rivers that run up into that 200,000, but they're day-use splash and giggle things. Mount Everest, you're going to learn more than you need to know about that, but obviously this is a picture that's generated a lot of interest. I don't even know where this is, but that looks bad, right? I mean, that's part of the story. And I think that the thing that's going on there, I know I won't be here tonight, so I'll just say my 2 cents on it. I think the biggest thing that's going on in this place is that there's a narrow weather window that constrains when people can do stuff. So there's a lot of people doing it all together, that other mountains have the luxury of spreading that use out temporarily through the year. And obviously this place gets a ton of attention when anything bad happens there or anything good, one way or the other. One last place I want to bring up is just a place I've been to a couple of times. It's not just the mountaineers that go up into alpine settings. It's trekkers too, people like me that don't have any intention of doing technical stuff. But we go to these places and we're like sheep. We go to places that get attention, that people say, oh, you've got to go there. And this is a place where every morning in the fall and spring trekking season, 1,000 people go up from this small village. They climb up to this place, which is really a fairly ordinary viewpoint of the Annapurna section of the Himalayas. But they all do it together, and it becomes this giant social thing. But there's a ton of impacts up there. It's kind of disgusting. There's human waste everywhere. There's not much management going on. And there's really no good reason to make everybody go up on Poon Hill. But I think it started with a Lonely Planet guide thing saying you got to do it. And ever since then, everybody's been doing it. So anyway, there are many places that give you nice views, and we could spread people out and not have these impacts, but it's going to take a sort of coordinated effort. All right, so what are my final thoughts about these various mountain capacities, taking these things together? So first of all, I'm not the first person to say this week, and you'll probably get more of it. The use is increasing. The numbers that the guy from Black Diamond was talking about, and which we heard today from the trust fund guys, it's just exploding. More people are gym rats and climbing and stuff. They're going to want to get outside eventually, maybe. We'll see. But if they do, and they go climbing, you're just going to see these increases. You're also seeing the increase in that commercial sector. I think that's going to increase with our generational change. People don't mind asking for help. That ethic of I got to do it myself is not as strong as it used to be. And the commercial guides are excellent at doing a bunch of things that people don't want to do, or improving either the gear or that expertise, and letting people do things that they otherwise couldn't do on their own. And that's both the service and changes the way that those places work. So if the use is not going away, the impacts probably aren't going away either. Not all of them are related to use directly, but a bunch of them are. And so if those impacts are going to happen, we're going to have to manage them. You're going to need a process. If you decide that you're going to need a capacity sometime, you're going to need a process. Go ahead and pick one. LAC, VERP, pick a capacity project. You got to pick one. You got to do indicators and standards. You got to spend the time, like Paul talked about this morning, with your different interest groups, and you got to work through the process. So just plan on it. It's going to cost money. It's going to suck if you're an agency. But if you're a stakeholder, it's an opportunity to influence government, and you should take advantage of it. If you know you're going to need a capacity, the earlier you do it, the better. You'll have more choices because you almost can never turn back the clock. The Selway is the best example of that, but there are river after river waited until the impacts were too high, and then they tried to turn back the clock, and it was politically infeasible. So if you think it's coming, do it. If you think it's hard now, wait 10 years. It's going to be really hard. All of those frameworks, those planning frameworks, emphasize picking important indicators. You got to figure that out for your place and start measuring it and monitoring it. Citizen science is a great way to help do that. Once you've figured out the relationship between use and all those important conditions that you care about, you're going to find that a couple of them are the limiting factor. And they may not even be the most important thing about the experience, but they're the limiting factor. So, if it's how many you can get through the Hillary steps or whatever, if that's the place, that's going to tell you how many you can put on that whole mountain. That may be the thing that does it. It may not be the most important thing about the trip, but it may be the thing that matters. Something that we don't have in the river world quite to the extent you do is the amount that weather can just delay and change everything. We usually can control the number coming in at the top and the number coming out at the bottom and spread them out nicely through the whole system, temporally and spatially. You guys just spend your life bunching up and causing problems for each other because of weather. And you get stuck together in places, or when it gets clear, everybody goes together. So it's the huge confound. The thing it creates is what we call in rivers is trips in trouble, especially private trips. Weather or other things, the curveball that comes at these folks, somebody getting hurt, causes a trip to be a problem now. And everybody else has to change their trips because this one trip is in trouble. And any of you that are in the rescue world know how that happens, because there's an ethic to help folks. And even though there's an ethic that also says you're supposed to be self-reliant, self-rescue, and that sort of thing, when somebody's in real trouble, everybody pitches in to help. On that climb I did on the Middle Teton, within 15 minutes, we had world-class climbers and rangers giving this woman morphine. She had 2 broken legs. She was fine by the end. But they had her fixed up just great before the rescue rangers even got there, before I'd even gotten down the hill to get the rescue rangers. So it's just amazing how that community works, but at the same time, most of those guys didn't want to spend their day giving morphine to this poor woman who had 2 broken legs. They wanted to be climbing the Grand or whatever they were planning to do that day. So it's on the agency to try to prevent these trips in trouble, and that's hard to do. And capacities play a role there. You guys heard about the climbing aids and the confound related to that. The decisions you make about those fixed ropes and other stuff are going to be massive with regard to capacity, because obviously you can go fast when those things are in place and you trust them and everybody uses them. But it changes the climb, right? As far as I can tell, there's big debates in your community over what's the right amount of that stuff in which kind of place. So anyway, that's going to be a huge confound and something you're going to have to deal with. And then I think the thing you're not spending enough time on is what is the experience that people are getting, the social impacts of these different places as they get crowded or as they have these things. And I think it's a researchable topic, and you could find out from your climbers what they like, what they're interested in. And maybe they're achievement-oriented and they don't care that there's tons of other people out there, but there are other people that may not feel that way. And I think that should be developed a little bit more in your community than I've seen so far. One place where they did spend some time on that is Half Dome, where they did a lot of work on counting people and then getting people's perceptions of those different numbers of people. But in the end, they based it mostly on safety. So in the end, they actually didn't rely on social impact data. But at least they know that the number they picked was in line with some of those tolerances for crowding. A couple of warnings. I think that a lot of mountains apparently are living by their overnight capacities of their huts or of their camping areas. But those seem fairly artificial to me, that are based more on history, because you can obviously put more tents in a place if you wanted to, and maybe someday you will. And so it's sort of an artificial capacity, maybe to meet social goals, but you haven't been transparent about it. So I'd be careful about using that, like on Mont Blanc, of saying that my hut size or my hut capacity is how many I'm going to have up there, because that could change. They could build a bigger hut. I don't want to sound like a jerk, and I think I was earlier to Ben when I talked about causation and correlation with leave no trace in education. I think education is the big driver of a lot of things and behavior, so I don't want to make fun of it. But don't count on it to fix your social impacts or safety impacts related to too high use. So sometimes you're going to have too many people because there's just too many people, not because they're behaving badly. They're just too many. And everything's a trade-off. The more regulation you get, you'll have some better conditions, but you're trading off freedom as a result of that. And it's always a give and take on that. It's a zero-sum game, unfortunately. So go find another mountain to climb that maybe isn't quite as high, but there's nobody on it than Denali. If you really want solitude in the high Alaska range, there's plenty of mountains that have nobody on it, I'm pretty sure. And I guess finally I would say that we're not at a position where one capacity fits all. It's definitely going to be a case by case. There's traditions and histories to these mountains that are going to drive things, and basically it means good news for consultants, because I think with each place you'll have to come in and do some studies and do some planning to work through the numbers. You won't be able to say, we do it like this at Rainier, so let's go do that at Long's Peak. It won't necessarily work like that, so you're going to have to do the hard work on that. All right, I think that's all I've got. If you want to talk to me about this stuff, I don't know anything about mountains, and I haven't done a study in those, but I would love to at some point. And I have done a bunch of them in river settings.
Questions there?
It's the after lunch doldrums.
Oh, we got one there.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question about your experience with enforcement and sanctioning people that are aware of regulations and they deviate because they were able to get a permit. And how are you going to ensure compliance or punish people that go out without a permit or over the wilderness maps to help people?
Well, so I'll talk about permit compliance first, and then we can talk about other kinds of compliance. So permit compliance is remarkably high in the river community. It's usually the early couple of years, there's some bitching and moaning about permits, and there's lots of debate about whether you pick the right number. Once you've picked the number and the permit system, there's more bitching about how the permit system works than the number. There's very little complaining about capacities. There's lots of complaints about how you manage to allocate that. But compliance is remarkably high. I'm sure the Park Service catches people on occasion. In fact, they're sort of famous for, I'm thinking of a Grand Canyon occasion where a guy was trying to run on high water and they were chasing him down with helicopters and stuff like that. So there's some times when people will bust the rules purposely, but by and large they just don't, and for permit compliance. The other kinds of things that people do compliance on, like carry out waste, fire pans, stuff like that. I think compliance on that, I think the reg comes first. If you just try to talk them into it, it doesn't work, or it hasn't so far. But if you educate at the same time that you regulate, within 10 years you'll have a norm established in the community and they will no longer need the regulation. And then you don't have to do much enforcement either. So I think those two things go together, education and regulation. But I think without the regulation behind it, you often don't get there. And that also depends on whether the behavior you're trying to get them to do somehow interferes with something else they're trying to do. So people really wanted to have fires on Middle Fork salmon trips, for instance. And there's plenty of trees down that burn there. Fire is actually part of the ecosystem. Ash isn't really a big problem. Every 3 or 4 years there's a big burn in there, and there's a bunch of ash put in there naturally. But we didn't like ash on beaches. It made it feel less wilderness-like that came from people's fires, so we made them carry out their ashes. So the reg came first, said carry out your ashes, and the equipment technology had to be there. So everybody brings paint cans and puts ashes in the paint cans. You're still a little warm, and you don't want to put that against a rubber raft. That might burn a hole in it or something. So, but they figured out how to do it, and then people got to do what they wanted, which was have a fire, but they also got to feel high and mighty about not leaving an impact. So it worked. Human waste, the story, I got to talk about this a few years ago at the exit strategies, but when they first proposed it in Grand Canyon 30 years ago, people were like, what? No chance. An 18-day trip in a hot place, and we're going to put it in what? In rocket boxes? They're going to explode, aren't they? Well, yeah, they did for a while, and it was bad. But they figured out the technology. You use poop powder, you put in your detergent, or whatever they use. They figured out different systems. It got better. Now we've got these great bags and the right chemicals that make that all work. And I think all of that technology, I don't want to downplay that at all. That's just fabulous, and you guys are going to adopt this just fine. In 10 years, you'll wonder why you had conferences about it. It was obvious you should do this. But at the time, it was hard, and the reg had to come first. So I hope that gets there far enough. Yeah?
Since you're a river expert, I wonder if you could talk about what you see that's happening with pack rafting in the national parks. It's sort of it seems to be perceived as a disruptive technology by some of the parks, and do you see any analogies between that and what's going on now?
Great. Well, I know you come from a group of people who do this aggressively, which is great. I've written about pack rafting. It's great. So for you, those of you who don't know, it's this thing that weighs about 5 pounds. There are people that are skilled at it can take it down class 4 or 5 rivers. They're running just as hard stuff as they run in hardshell kayaks or rafts. And with a 5-pound boat, it opens up this whole new world of hiking up over a pass and into a basin and running this river. You no longer need an airplane to take you there. It's incredibly, it's this really cool way of traveling. You can carry bikes on it, so you can bicycle up some trails and then float out. It's amazing what these folks are doing. It's a non-traditional use, and what's the gut reaction from every agency that you've ever heard looking at a non-traditional use? It's 9. No, you can't. So that's what they started with. But I think the resistance is breaking down, and it's like any other activity. It's going to have some impacts. It's going to put people where they weren't before. They may not be able to do some of the other things. They can't carry out their waste in the same way that a 16-passenger raft can carry it out. So they might have to figure out some different things that they have to do. But I think managed, and as soon as we have a few agencies that stick their neck out on it, I think it's just going to get better and better, and they'll figure it out. But yeah, it's hard. I remember your buddy, I think, Roman Dial, you probably know him because I know he works where you guys. He wanted to go down the Grand Canyon. And when he applied to that, he applied to the river manager. And one of the things she did was she called me up and said, "Who is this guy?" And I don't know him personally, but I know of him because anyone in Alaska knows of him. He's this incredible wilderness adventurer. And I said, "Oh, just let him go." And so anyway, she took some time, but that's where she got to. And I think she had long discussions with him on how to work that out. But, high-skilled wilderness advocates like him can do this trip, can go on these trips anywhere and have very low impact. But not everybody's Roman Dial. So anyway.
Okay, well, thank you.
Great. Thanks.